There is a particular kind of silence that comes with stepping into a story that feels older than you, older than your parents, older than the language you speak every day. When I sat down to watch Nosferatu, 2024, I couldn't help but feel the echo of nearly a century of shadows behind me, stretching back to the original 1922 nightmare that stole into cinema like a fever dream. I only say the name once because it needs no repetition. It is the ghost at the banquet, the ancient name whispered once, and then left to haunt the mind. What drew me most wasn't only that I was about to see a gothic horror retold in modern cinema. It was that I was about to step into a cultural echo chamber, a place where literature, myth, and cinema folded back on themselves, making time irrelevant. For me, that is what this experience was. Not just watching a film, but feeling generations of fear and fascination converging in a single darkened room. I have always loved Gothic literature. I remember, as a teenager, reading Poe under a flickering bulb during a power outage, half scared that the shadows in the corners were listening to every word my eyes absorbed. That was a doorway through which I walked into stories like Dracula, and later the strange, pale adaptations that try to translate those novels into moving images. Watching this new version, I carried those old sensations with me, almost as if I were reuniting with a childhood friend who had changed so much I barely recognized him, yet still carried the same haunted eyes. That feeling, the one where nostalgia collides with renewal, was the essence of my journey through this film. The film does not make itself easy. It doesn't invite you in with gentle exposition or friendly hand-holding. It thrusts you into a world of candlelit corridors, storm-lashed coastlines, and faces that seem carved out of grief itself. From the opening minutes, you sense that the director is not interested in comforting his audience. He wants us to squirm, to breathe shallowly, to look over our shoulders even though we know we are alone in our living rooms. And isn't that, in a way, the purest inheritance of Gothic horror? It is not about jump scares or sudden shocks. It is about the crawling dread that lingers even when the credits roll. What impressed me most was how it balanced the literary heart of the story with the cinematic language of today. It did not reduce itself to spectacle. Yes, there are grand, unforgettable images. The ship creaking into harbor, its sails rotting like torn shrouds, the sight of a castle looming against a blood moon, the brief glimmer of red on white snow. But the power lies not in how large these moments feel, but in how heavy they settle in the chest. Every image seemed like an engraving from some forbidden text, a storybook for adults who know that fairy tales never end well. I kept thinking of how literature often dwells in suggestion, in what is hinted at more than described. This film follows that path. It does not show you everything at once. It leaves room for your mind to fill in the blank spaces. In fact, some of the most chilling moments were not the ones in which the creature appeared, but the ones where his presence was felt in absence. The way a candle flickered too violently in a draftless room. The way a character's face collapsed into despair at a sound only they could hear. That silence, that space, was a true terror. At the heart of it all lies the strange, uneasy dance between desire and destruction. Gothic stories always return to this theme. The idea that to yearn for something deeply is to risk being consumed by it. The central relationship in this film is built on that tension. She, fragile yet resolute, becomes a vessel for the audience's dread and longing. He, monstrous and gaunt, is both predator and victim, cursed to embody hunger that can never be satisfied. Watching them orbit each other felt like reading a tragic poem where every line was already fated to end in ruin. There was a moment early on that stayed with me more than any elaborate sequence. The sight of a figure standing by a window, looking out into a night swollen with fog. The simplicity of that image reminded me of how loneliness is perhaps the most terrifying monster of all. That, I think, is why these stories endure. They aren't only about vampires or castles or curses. They are about the aching void inside every human heart, the part of us that fears being forgotten or abandoned. The film knew this, and it pressed its finger against that bruise until I winced. Of course, it is impossible not to acknowledge the craftsmanship that went into the details. The set design felt like it had been dug out of the earth itself, with walls that seemed to sweat moisture, staircases that bent under unseen weight, and furniture that creaked like it was remembering the lives of the dead. The costumes clung to the actors like second skins, heavy with the dust of centuries. Even the sound design became a character. The echo of boots on stone, the hollow hush of wind through broken shutters, the wet smacking of rats in the corners. Each element layered upon the next, until I no longer felt like a viewer. I felt like a trespasser in a world that did not want me there. The plot itself unfolds slowly, deliberately, like a sickness spreading through the body. A young woman's life, seemingly ordinary, is pulled into the orbit of something ancient. A journey is made across land and sea, into the lair of being who should not exist. And from there, events spiral. A town begins to rot from within, men of reason falter before the unreasonable, and hope itself becomes as fragile as glass. What I appreciated was that the film never rushed these developments. It let them breathe. Each stage of the story built upon the last, until the tension became unbearable. But it isn't all dread. There are moments of strange, terrible beauty. A candle illuminating a face in perfect chiaroscuro. A pair of hands meeting, trembling, across a wooden table. Snow falling, soundless, over a graveyard as if trying to bless what cannot be blessed. These were the moments that reminded me why Gothic art has always been my refuge. Because it sees the world as both cruel and sublime, and it teaches us to hold both truths at once. I can't give away everything. Where would the mystery be in that? But I will say that the story is not content with simple monsters and victims. It twists, it deepens, it forces you to question who truly deserves pity and who truly deserves fear. There are revelations that reframe what you thought you knew, and choices that leave scars not only on the characters, but on the viewer's conscience. By the time the final act approaches, you feel drained, as if you have lived through a nightmare that is both ancient and startlingly new. What makes this particular retelling matter is not just the story it tells, but the way it honors its lineage. The shadows of Murnau's 1922 silent film linger here, but so do the echoes of Stoker, of Shelley, of Poe. It is a work of cinema, yes, but also a dialogue with literature, with myth, with the human psyche itself. Watching it, I felt as though I were leafing through a book written in ink and blood, one that had been waiting for me all along. And perhaps that is why, when the credits finally rolled, I did not feel relief. I felt gratitude. Gratitude that art still dares to unsettle us. Gratitude that filmmakers still believe we can handle darkness without sugarcoating it. Gratitude that horror can still be about more than fright, that it can be about reflection, about confronting what we fear in ourselves. To those of you who love stories, who see films not only as entertainment but as mirrors and windows, I say this. Here's a work that will stay with you. It will not let you sleep easily. It will not give you the comfort of clean conclusions, but it will give you something better. The reminder that to be alive is to be haunted, and that sometimes being haunted is the truest form of being human. When I think about the first movements of the story, I remember the atmosphere before I remember the details. It was like stepping into an oil painting that had been left in a damp attic for a century, the colors darkened and the corners peeling, but the weight of its meaning still pressing on you. The first half of this tale does not hurry. It drags you by the sleeve through corridors of shadow, daring you to look away even as the air grows heavier with each passing minute. It begins with the woman at the center of it all, though she is never introduced with grandeur. She is ordinary in her suffering, fragile in the way life has worn her down, yet there is something luminous in her stillness. You feel her unease almost before you know her name. She seems to be waiting for something, though she cannot say what. And when the first letters arrive, when whispers pass to the village about a mysterious benefactor in the mountains, you realize that she has already been chosen. There is a sense of inevitability here, as if she were born only to walk this path, like a moth that has always been destined to burn itself on the flame. The early scenes anchor themselves in domestic spaces. Wooden homes lit by candles, kitchens where the sound of cutlery is too loud, streets where the snow never seems to melt. These places are not empty, but they feel hollow, as if everyone who inhabits them is haunted by the same invisible shadow. When she steps outside, her footsteps echo against stone in a way that makes you shiver, because it sounds too much like loneliness. Even the smallest details, water dripping from a gutter, a cat slinking into an alley, the way curtains move though no wind stirs, serve as reminders that something unseen is already here, watching. And then comes the journey. She must leave her fragile familiarity behind and travel into the heart of darkness. And this transition is where the dread truly begins to grow. I remember the carriage scenes most vividly. Horses steaming in the cold night air, their eyes rolling as though they too know what lies ahead. Drivers who will not meet her gaze, who cross themselves when she asks questions. The road winds higher into mountains, snow closing in on either side like the walls of a tomb. The sound of the wheels crunching on ice becomes hypnotic, a rhythm that feels more like a dirge in progress. There is a moment, quiet and fleeting, when the carriage stops at a small inn. She is told to rest, to wait until morning, but the innkeeper's wife cannot stop staring at her, and finally presses a crude charm into her palm, muttering that it may protect her. Of course, the charm is useless. No trinket of wood or silver can protect someone from what she is walking into, but the gesture is human, and in that small kindness lies the heartbreak of the story. People see her doom, they try to resist it, but all resistance is nothing against the gravity of what waits. By the time she reaches the outskirts of the castle, the journey feels less like travel and more like descent. The carriage will go no further, the driver refusing to climb the last stretch. She must walk. Each step is swallowed by the snow, the world around her falling into silence, so complete it feels like being buried alive. And then on the horizon, the castle emerges, not as a building, but as a silhouette cut into the night. It does not look constructed. It looks grown, like some malignant fungus sprouting from the mountain itself. Its windows glow faintly, as though the stones themselves have veins of fire inside them. Inside, the air is colder still. The first halls she walks through are vast but barren, filled with echoes that return her every breath to her like mockery. When the master finally appears, he does not storm onto the stage. He simply materializes, as if he'd been there all along, standing in the shadow of a column, waiting. His appearance is grotesque, yes, gaunt and pale, eyes too deep in their sockets, but it is not his features that strike you hardest. It is the way he looks at her, not like a predator sizing a prey, nor like a man appraising beauty, but like a starving man seeing bread for the first time in years. That hunger is infinite, and it is terrifying. Their first interactions are quiet, almost polite. He speaks in measured tones, his words formal, even courteous. But beneath every syllable lies an ocean of despair. You feel that he does not want companionship so much as absolution, and she, sensing this, cannot help but be drawn closer even as terror curls inside her. This paradox is what drives the first half forward. The tension between attraction and revulsion, between pity and horror. Meanwhile, outside the castle, the world begins to unravel. The ship that carries his coffin sets sail, crew whispering about a strange sickness among the rats in the hold. One by one, sailors fall ill, their bodies discovered pale and drained, their eyes staring at nothing. The captain alone seems aware that something unnatural stalks the decks, but his awareness does not save him. When the ship finally arrives in port, it drifts silently, every man aboard reduced to a husk. Townsfolk gather to stare at the cursed vessel, fear already spreading through their whispers like a plague. Back in the castle, the woman becomes more and more entangled in the master's web. He shows her rooms filled with relics, portraits whose subjects seem to watch her, libraries of books written in dead languages. She wanders through these chambers as if walking through someone else's dream. At night, she wakes to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, though no one is there. She begins to suspect that time itself is slipping, that she is no longer certain how long she has been there. And in a way, she is right. The castle does not measure time as the outside world does. It exists in a perpetual twilight, where days and nights fold into each other until meaning itself corrodes. There is one scene that broke me with its intimacy. She sits at a table, hands trembling, as he places a goblet before her. He does not ask her to drink. He only watches, eyes fixed not on her face but on her pulse, as if mesmerized by the faint flicker beneath her skin. The silence stretches until it is unbearable, and then he withdraws, leaving her alone with the echo of her own heartbeat. That was when I understood the horror here is not only what he might do, but what he cannot stop himself from desiring. His curse is not simply that he destroys others, but that he must live forever in the knowledge of that destruction. As the first half draws toward its turning point, the threads tighten. The town begins to choke on fear, coffins lining the streets as plague spreads unchecked. The woman, torn between escape and a strange sense of duty, realizes that she has become both prisoner and participant. And he, the figure of shadow and hunger, grows bolder, appearing closer each time, his presence seeping into every corner of her life. There is no dramatic announcement of what is coming, only a slow tightening of the noose, until you realize that both she and the town are standing on the edge of catastrophe. And then, just as the weight becomes too much, the first half leaves you in suspension. It is not a cliffhanger in the modern sense, but pause in the breath, the moment before the scream. You know the descent will continue, deeper and darker. But for now, you are left staring into the abyss with her, unsure whether you are more afraid of the monster before you or the loneliness inside yourself. The second half of the story begins not with thunder, but with a whisper, and that whisper is the sound of inevitability. The plague has taken hold, not only of the town, but of the hearts of those who live within it. People walk the streets like shadows of themselves, muttering prayers they no longer believe will be answered. Doors are barred, windows are shuttered, yet still the sickness seeps through the cracks. The ship that drifted into the harbor is spoken of as an omen, a curse carried on the tide, and every coffin carried to the churchyard is a reminder that the disease is not of this earth. I remember how the camera lingered on the faces of children staring out from behind curtains, their eyes too wide, too hollow, as if even they had accepted that hope no longer had a place here. Inside the castle, the woman's resolve hardens. She knows now that she is not a guest but a captive, though her captivity is not enforced by chains or guards. It is subtler, more insidious. The way every hallway seems to lead back to the same room, the way the doors that were open yesterday are locked today, the way the air itself feels like a net pressing against her skin. She has seen enough of her host to understand the nature of his hunger, and though she recoils from it, part of her also begins to pity him. That is the most dangerous emotion of all. Pity, because it leads her closer, even as every instinct urges her to flee. There is a night when she dreams of escape. She imagines herself running through the snow, down the mountain, into the village where life still clings stubbornly to existence. But when she wakes, she finds herself not in her bed, but in the crypt beneath the castle. The stone slabs are damp with condensation, the air heavy with the smell of earth and rot, and coffins lie open as though waiting. She stumbles back, choking on fear, only to see him standing there in the corner, watching silently. He does not touch her, does not speak, but the meaning is clear. She belongs to this place now, whether she admits it or not. Meanwhile, in the village, suspicion grows. The townsfolk whisper the woman who left and never returned, of the ship that arrived empty but for death, of the castle looming like a vulture over their lives. Some speak of burning it to the ground, but none dare climb the mountain. They know instinctively that fire alone cannot cleanse what festers in those halls. A priest insists that faith will shield them, but even as he speaks, his hands shake and his eyes dart nervously toward the shadows. Faith, in this world, is not enough. The second act of horror begins in earnest when the master descends into the town itself. At first, no one notices him. He moves like a shadow, slipping through alleys, appearing on balconies, vanishing into doorways. But soon the deaths multiply in ways that cannot be hidden. A mother is found drained in her bed, her child crying beside her. A butcher collapses in the middle of the market, his throat marred by wounds no knife could have made. Dogs howl at night, their cries echoing to the streets until no one dares sleep. Panic becomes a new law of the town, and with panic comes cruelty. Neighbors accuse one another of bringing the curse. Strangers are beaten in the street for imagined sins, and the plague of fear proves as deadly as the plague of blood. The woman becomes the axis of it all. She begins to understand that she is not simply his chosen victim, but his chosen mirror. He sees in her the humanity he has lost, and though he terrifies her, she cannot help but recognize the loneliness that radiates from him. Their interactions grow more intimate in the strangest of ways. He sits across from her at a long dining table, the distance between them filled with silence, so thick it feels like a wall. He asks her questions about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. His voice is quiet, rasping, but not without a strange tenderness. She answers reluctantly, yet with each word she speaks, she feels herself pulled deeper into his orbit. It is not love, nor is it simple terror. It is something more complicated, more tragic. the recognition that even monsters crave connection. One sequence remains carved into my memory. She wanders through the castle at night and finds a painting of a woman who looks uncannily like her. The portrait is cracked with age, the paint flaking, but the resemblance is undeniable. When she touches the canvas, dust falling from her fingers, she realizes what it means. She is not the first. She is only the latest in a line of souls who have been lured into this cycle, each one repeating the same fate, each one mistaken for salvation. The weight of that discovery nearly breaks her, and yet it also steels her resolve. If she is to be part of the story, she must choose how it ends. The turning point arrives when the townsfolk finally storm the castle. They come armed with torches and axes, shouting prayers and curses, their fear boiling over into rage. But the castle swallows them. Corridors twist, doors slam shut, screams echo until silence falls again. When morning comes, only a few stragglers stumble back down the mountain, their faces blank, their eyes glazed as though they have left part of themselves behind. The castle has become not only a place but a predator, feeding on anyone foolish enough to challenge it. It is then that the woman makes her decision. She knows that no priest, no mob, no superstition will end this. Only sacrifice will. In the final act of the first night of terror, she confronts him directly. She does not scream or beg. She offers herself. But there is a condition. He must come to her not as a beast, but as a man. He hesitates, torn between desire and dread, because he knows what will happen. And yet hunger wins. He draws closer, trembling, his lips brushing her throat. And as he drinks, she holds him, cradling him almost tenderly, even as her life drains away. The power of that scene lies not only in its horror, but in its intimacy. It is not staged as violence, but as a kind of tragic embrace, a union that is both love and annihilation. Her sacrifice becomes the only weapon that can destroy him, for by giving herself freely, she transforms his hunger into his downfall. As the sun rises, his body crumbles into ash in her arms, and the castle itself seems to sigh, its stones cracking, its shadows dispersing. Yet victory does not feel like triumph. She lies pale, fading, the life leaving her body as the townsfolk rush into the ruined hall. They see what she has done, but they cannot save her. She dies as the first rays of morning fall across her face, and in that moment, she is not only victim but redeemer. The curse lifts, the plague ebbs, and yet the cost is unbearable. The town is saved, but she is gone, and what remains is silence. The final images linger like scars. The castle, broken but not destroyed, still looms against the horizon. The townsfolk bury their dead, their mourning subdued, as if they fear to speak too loudly lest a nightmare return. A child drops the useless charm given to the woman at the inn, and it sinks into the mud, forgotten. And somewhere in the ashes, a single rat scurries free, carrying with the suggestion that nothing is ever truly over. What makes the second half unforgettable is not only the destruction, but the ambiguity it leaves behind. Was she savior or fool? Was he monster or tragic soul? Did the town truly escape, or did they merely delay the return of the darkness? These questions linger long after the credits roll, and in their lingering lies the essence of Gothic horror. The refusal to give us comfort, the insistence that the world is full of shadows we cannot banish. When I left the theater, I felt heavy, as though I had carried someone else's grief with me. And yet I was grateful. Grateful that art still dares to demand so much of us. Grateful that stories can still haunt, still disturb, still carve themselves into our memory like names on gravestones. The second half of this tale is not simply an ending. It is an inheritance, a reminder that we are all, in some way, living among ghosts, and that every embrace carries within it the seed of loss. What lingers most after the story has ended is not the memory of single scenes, but the people who inhabited them, their shapes carved into the air like silhouettes burned into the walls by lightning. The characters of this tale are not simply figures who move the plot forward. They are vessels of themes, mirrors of fear and longing, embodiments of what Gothic stories have always tried to tell us about ourselves. To speak of them is to speak of the very marrow of the film, because without them, the shadows would be empty and the silence would be meaningless. At the heart of it all is a woman whose journey from fragile stillness to tragic resolve is the pulse of the narrative. She begins not as a heroine, nor as a warrior, but as someone weighed down by the ordinary burdens of life. There is something profoundly relatable in her first appearance. She is not glamorous, not larger than life, but real in her weariness. That ordinariness makes her all the more remarkable when she begins to face the incomprehensible. The great Gothic tradition has always relied on women who step into the unknown, whose innocence or fragility becomes a stage upon which terror performs itself. But here, fragility is not weakness. It is a kind of strength, because it allows her to carry the weight of horror without breaking entirely. I think of her hands often, how they trembled when she touched the charm given to her, how they steadied when she held the goblet, how they finally cradled a monster in an embrace that was both surrender and defiance. Her body tells a story as much as her words, and the actress understands this deeply. She conveys not just fear but compassion, not just despair but endurance. What struck me most was how she did not simply resist the darkness, but allowed herself to see it, to pity it. And in doing so, she transformed the story from one of simple victimization into one of complex humanity. She is every lonely soul who has ever stared at the abyss and felt it stare back. Opposite her stands a figure who gives the story its name, though he is less a man than an idea wrapped in flesh. His design is grotesque in a way only something tragic can be. His body a map of hunger, his eyes bottomless pits of centuries gone wrong. And yet, there is something mournful in his presence. He is not played as a cackling villain or an unstoppable force of nature. He is played as a being who carries the burden of eternity like a stone chained to his chest. His hunger is terrifying, yes, but his loneliness is even more so. When he looks at her, you feel the ache of someone who has outlived everything worth loving, reduced to an endless cycle of taking without satisfaction. What makes him compelling is that he is not simple evil. He is more like a cautionary tale of desire unbound, of need turned monstrous. In his silence, in the way he hovers just beyond the candlelight, in the way his shadow touches her before his body does, he becomes not just a character, but a symbol of everything we fear about our own appetites. The best Gothic villains are the ones we cannot dismiss entirely, the ones who remind us that the line between monster and man is thinner than we want to believe. Here, that line nearly disappears. Around these two central figures orbit the townsfolk, each of them fragments of a larger mirror reflecting humanity's response to terror. There's the priest, clinging to faith as though words alone could banish shadows, his voice cracking with the weight of disbelief. He embodies our desperate need to believe that order and protection still exist, even when the evidence says otherwise. His prayers are not answered, but his persistence is what makes him human. Then there are the villagers, whose fear curdles into suspicion and cruelty, who lash out at one another rather than face the true source of their dread. They remind us that horror is never confined to castles and creatures. It lives also in the way humans betray each other when survival is at stake. The ship's crew form another layer of character, even though they are fleeting presences. Their descent into death aboard the vessel becomes a miniature tragedy within the larger one. Each man reduced to silence by something they cannot fight. The captain, grim and stoic, steering his doomed ship into harbor, becomes almost mythic, a figure of futility who embodies a human impulse to confront danger even when it cannot be beaten. His death is as much a character statement as any monologue, that courage alone cannot stop decay, and sometimes all that remains is to carry the burden of doom to its destination. Even minor figures, the innkeeper's wife who presses a charm into the woman's hand, the children who watch through the curtains, the men who storm the castle only to vanish into its halls, each add their brushstroke to the painting. In Gothic stories, no character is wasted, because each is a reflection of the central themes. Innocence, faith, cowardice, courage, all rendered small in the face of something vast and unspeakable. But the most important relationship is between her and him, between fragility and hunger, between pity and monstrosity. Their interactions are slow, quiet, and yet unbearably charged. She becomes not just his potential victim, but his confessor, his mirror, the proof that even after centuries of taking, some part of him still longs to be seen. He becomes not just her captor, but her temptation, her test, the measure of whether she will recoil or reach out. In the end, her embrace of him is not simply surrender, but defiance of fear itself. By giving herself freely, she becomes the only one who holds power over him, turning what seemed like helplessness into the deepest act of strength. What fascinates me is how these characters are written not as individuals in isolation, but as archetypes reborn. She is the Gothic heroine, yes, but she is also every person who has ever confronted loneliness and chosen compassion instead of cruelty. He is the vampire, yes, but he is also every human who has ever allowed desire to consume them. The villagers are the fearful crowd, yes, but they are also us in our worst moments when we choose suspicion over solidarity. Each character is both themselves and a symbol, both unique and universal. That layering is what makes them endure in the mind long after the film ends. When I walked away from the story, I realized that the characters had not left me. The woman's resolve, the monster's loneliness, the villager's fear, all of it had become a kind of haunting inside me. That is a true mark of Gothic storytelling. The characters do not vanish with the credits. They continue to live in your thoughts, whispering in the quiet hours, reminding you of your own shadows. And so, when I think of this film now, I do not think of it as a sequence of events, but as a gallery of souls, each one etched in chiaroscuro, each one a reminder that horror is never about the fangs or the coffins or the castles. It is about people, fragile, desperate, yearning, doomed, and the ways in which their humanity shines all the brighter when the darkness closes in. Sometimes the story of a film is only half of its life. The other half lives in the whispers from the set, the small accidents that become myths, the strange decisions that shape the final product, and the coincidences that seem too uncanny to dismiss. When I began digging into the strangeness that surrounded this version of the tale, I realized that it is haunted not only by its subject matter, but also by the peculiarities of its creation. Watching it is one thing. Knowing what happened behind the curtain is another experience entirely. The first strange fact is simply that this movie exists at all. Think about it. A modern studio investing millions into a story that first took shape in 1922, a story itself already an unauthorized copy of Dracula. The original silent film survived only through fragments because Stoker's widow sued production and ordered every reel destroyed. Yet, like the vampire portrayed, the film refused to die. It hid in the shadows of cinema history until it was reborn again and again, first in murky VHS transfers, later in remastered editions, and now, nearly a century later, in this grand reimagining. There is something uncanny in that resilience. It is as though the story itself possesses the same immortality as its monster, impossible to kill no matter how many times the stake is driven. Another strangeness lies in the casting. Ana de Armas was already celebrated for roles that combine fragility with fire, but stepping into this role meant embodying not just a woman, but an archetype, a vessel of Gothic inheritance. She spent months researching not only vampire folklore, but also 19th century ballet movements, believing that the grace of physical stillness was essential to portraying a character caught between desire and dread. She studied photographs of silent film actresses, teaching herself how to let her body tell stories even in silence. Watching her on screen, you can sense that preparation, not in grand gestures, but in the way her eyes widen fractionally before terror strikes, or the way her shoulders tighten when she senses the shadow behind her. Then there is Bill Skarsgård, the face behind the monster. It is no coincidence that he was chosen after playing another kind of predator in it. But here, his preparation took on eerie turns. Reports suggest that he spent long hours studying not only animals, but also patients suffering from wasting illnesses, trying to replicate the tension between predatory instinct and physical weakness. Crew members recalled how he would remain in costume between takes, moving slowly, avoiding eye contact, making everyone around him uncomfortable even when the cameras weren't rolling. Some said it felt less like acting and more like possession, as though the character had seeped into his bones. One of the strangest facts concerns the castle itself. Though the film was shot across several locations in Europe, many interiors were constructed on sound stages that were deliberately designed to be disorienting. Corridors were built at slight angles. Doors were made smaller than normal. Ceilings tilted just enough to make them feel oppressive. The intention was to create a sense of unease not only for the audience but for the actors themselves. In interviews, several cast members admitted that they often felt physically sick or dizzy while filming, unable to tell whether they were imagining it or whether the set design was subtly manipulating their perception. That architectural trickery is invisible on first viewing, but once you know it, you cannot unsee it. The castle becomes even more of a labyrinth, designed not to house but to unsettle. Sound design provided another layer of uncanniness. The filmmakers chose to incorporate actual recordings of nocturnal animals, bats, owls, foxes, layered beneath the score so faintly that most viewers would never consciously notice. Yet the brain registers those sounds, and they spark a primitive unease. Even stranger, some of the creaks and groans of the castle were not created artificially, but recorded from abandoned houses in Eastern Europe. The sound team spent nights in derelict buildings, capturing the moans of wind through broken windows, the sighs of timbers shifting, the drip of water onto stone. Those sounds were transplanted directly into film, meaning that the castle's voice is, in a sense, real. There were also accidents that seemed to carry their own eerie significance. One day, during a night shoot in a forest, the generator's power and the lights failed completely. For over an hour, the cast and crew stood in total darkness, the only illumination the faint glow of the moon. When power was restored, the cameras had accidentally captured footage of Skarsgård standing motionless in the dark, his pale face barely visible, eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. The shot was so unsettling that the director kept in the final cut, claiming that no planned scene could capture the essence of horror so perfectly. Another story comes from the ship sequence. The production had built a partial replica of a 19th century vessel and filmed many scenes on open water. During one take, thick fog rolled in unexpectedly, enveloping the ship so completely that the crew lost sight of land. For nearly 2 hours they drifted, unable to orient themselves, with nothing visible but gray mist in every direction. Though no one was harmed, the experience rattled them deeply, and the footage captured in those moments was used in the film. That sense of being lost in a void, cut off from the world, was not special effects but lived reality. Even the costumes carried their own oddities. The designer sourced authentic 19th century fabrics, some more than 100 years old, from vintage shops and estate sales. Many were delicate, fraying, infused with the smell of age. One dress worn by the Armos was reportedly so fragile that it tore whenever she moved too quickly, forcing her to adopt slow, careful gestures. The accidents created by that fragility shaped her performance, making her movement seem hesitant, deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was as though the costume itself was dictating the character's presence. Stranger still was the atmosphere on set. Multiple crew members spoke of uncanny sensations, cold drafts in sealed rooms, unexplained flickers of light, equipment failing without cause. One cameraman insisted he saw a figure move across the background during a take, though no one was there. The director dismissed it as exhaustion, but when the footage was reviewed, a faint shadow did appear where none should have been. It was left out of the film, but the story spread, and whispers of a curse followed the production thereafter. The editing process added its own layer of oddity. The team discovered that several reels had inexplicably degraded, developing blotches and scratches despite being stored under perfect conditions. Rather than reshoot, the director chose to incorporate those flaws, claiming they added to the sense of unease, as if the film itself were infected by the story it was telling. The result is a movie that looks haunted not just in content, but in texture, every frame scarred with its own history. Perhaps the most fascinating fact of all is that no two audiences have quite the same experience. This is partly due to deliberate choices. The soundtrack was mixed with subtle variations. So in some theaters, the score emphasizes the strings, in others the percussion, in others the droning whispers beneath. The effect is that viewers leave with slightly different impressions of the same scenes. Some recall hearing faint whispers in the background. Others insist they did not. The director explained this as a way of making the film itself feel alive, shifting its shape depending on who encounters it, much like the vampire at heart. All of these facts, casting obsessions, haunted sets, vanishing power, wandering ships, cursed costumes, form a mosaic of strangeness that mirrors the story itself. What I find most remarkable is how they blur the line between fiction and reality. Was it simply method acting that made Skarsgård seem possessed, or something darker? Was the figure on the footage just a trick of light, or did the film inherit the ghost of its own legacy? These are the kinds of questions that elevate cinema from entertainment to myth. When I reflect on these peculiarities, I realize they are not mere trivia. They are part of the experience, part of the haunting. Knowing that the sets were tilted makes the disorientation more powerful. Knowing that real abandoned houses gave their voices to the soundtrack makes the castle seem alive. Knowing that fog trapped the crew at sea makes the ship's sequence almost unbearable in its authenticity. These facts transform the movie into something more than a film. They make it a ritual, a reenactment of strangeness, as though everyone who worked on it was not just creating a story, but participating in it. And that, perhaps, is the strangest fact of all, that the film does not end when the screen goes dark. It continues in the stories of those who made it, in the odd accidents and eerie coincidences that cling to it like cobwebs. To watch it is to step into a lineage of accidents, lawsuits, curses, and obsessions that stretches back over a century. To know these things is to understand that the vampire is not just on the screen. It is in the history of cinema itself, refusing to die, returning again and again in new guises, feeding not on blood but on our imagination. When the last of the images had faded from the screen, I found myself sitting in silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because I felt that words would fail to carry the weight of what I had just seen. This is a true measure of a film like this. Not that it entertains, not that it frightens in a conventional sense, but that it compels you to sit in its shadow and think. It does not let you leave easily. To approach it critically is to surrender to the fact that the events are not just spectacles of horror, but meditations on existence itself. They are mirrors held up to human frailty, framed in candlelight and drenched in the language of nightmare. The first event that demands analysis is the journey itself, the passage from the village into mountains, from familiarity into the realm of the uncanny. This is a motif as old as storytelling, the hero, or in this case the reluctant heroine, stepping out of the known world into the domain of dread. Yet what makes it striking here is how the journey does not feel like progress but like regression, as though she is not moving forward into discovery, but backward into some primal darkness humanity has always tried to flee. The carriage ride, the faltering horses, the driver who dares not look her in the eye, all of it speaks to the inevitability of descent. In critical terms, this is not just geography but psychology. She is descending into the subconscious, into the landscape of repressed desires and unspoken fears. The event is both literal and metaphorical, and its power lies in forcing us to recognize that horror is always both. Another event that reverberates with meaning is the arrival of the ship. It drifts silently into harbor, crewed only by corpses, its sails ragged, its timbers groaning. The townsfolk gather in hushed terror, staring at it as though it were a prophecy carved in wood. On the surface, it is a spectacle of death, a chilling set piece. But beneath that, it functions as allegory. The ship is contagion, the foreign body that brings plague to community, echoing centuries of human fear about the stranger, the outsider, the unknown. Historically, ships carried not only trade but also disease, and the film captures that historical anxiety with almost too much precision. Critics may debate whether it is meant as commentary on pandemics or isolationism, but what is certain is that the image of that ghostly vessel resonates because it speaks to something universal. Our terror of contamination, both physical and moral. The relationship between the woman and the monster is another critical event, though it unfolds in fragments rather than a single moment. Each time they meet, the dynamic shifts slightly, from suspicion to fear, from revulsion to pity, from distance to closeness. The most telling scene, the one where he offers her the goblet and watches her pulse with ravenous longing, functions as more than just suspense. It is a crystallization of the Gothic obsession with desire. To critics of literature, this moment recalls the writings of Freud, who saw in the vampire the embodiment of repressed sexuality, the forbidden hunger that must be hidden yet cannot be eradicated. To others, it recalls feminist interpretations of Gothic fiction, where women are placed in positions of both victimhood and agency, where their bodies become the battleground between power and surrender. Watching her tremble as he hovers near, one cannot help but think of those layers, how the story is never just about blood, but about the dangerous intimacy between longing and annihilation. The storming of the castle by the villagers is another event that begs critical examination. At first glance, it seems like a conventional climax, the people rising up against a monster, torches in hand, determined to destroy the source of their suffering. Yet the film subverts this expectation by showing their failure. The castle consumes them, disorients them, sends them fleeing in terror. This is not a triumphant moment of human solidarity. It is a moment of human futility. From a critical perspective, this aligns with the Gothic tradition of undermining Enlightenment ideals of progress and reason. The villagers believe they can solve the problem with fire and force, but the castle represents the irrational, the chaotic, the ungovernable forces of existence. Their failure is a reminder that not all problems can be solved with collective willpower, that some shadows resist even the brightest flames. The climax itself, the woman offers herself freely, cradling the monster even as he feeds, may be the most complex event in the entire film. It is not a simple victory, not a cathartic slaying of the beast. It is a sacrifice that functions as both triumph and tragedy. Critics might call it a reworking of the Christ narrative, where salvation comes through self-offering, where love conquers not by domination but by surrender. Others may see it as feminist reclamation, where the heroine transforms from victim to author of her fate by choosing the terms of her death. Still others may interpret it through the lens of existential philosophy. She stares into the abyss and chooses to embrace it, asserting agency in a world otherwise devoid of meaning. What matters most, however, is that the event resists simplification. It is layered, contradictory, paradoxical, just like the human condition itself. Even the smaller events hold weight. The innkeeper's wife pressing a crude charm into her palm becomes, in retrospect, a symbol of the futility of superstition, of the ways humans cling to tokens when they have nothing else. The captain standing at the helm of his doomed ship is not merely a side plot, but a meditation on courage in the face of inevitability. The discovery of the portrait that resembles her is not just a Gothic trope, but a chilling reminder of cycles, of repetition, of the way history traps us into reliving the same patterns again and again. Each event, when examined critically, expands beyond its immediate narrative function into metaphor, allegory, philosophy. What fascinates me most is how the film engages with its own legacy. It knows it is an adaptation of an adaptation, that it carries the ghost of Murnau's silent masterpiece and the shadow of Stoker's novel. Certain events seem staged with that awareness, as though they are speaking both to characters and to us as viewers who know the history. When the monster appears silhouetted in a doorway, it is not only terrified within the story, but also a nod to that famous image from 1922, reminding us that horror itself has a lineage, a genealogy of images that return to haunt us. In this sense, the film's events are metatextual. They are not only narrative, but also commentary on narrative, reminding us that we are watching a story that has been told and retold, each telling reshaping the myth while preserving its core. The film's thematic resonance deepens when you consider how it uses these events to question what it means to be human. The plague, the hunger, the sacrifice, each is both literal and symbolic. The plague is disease, yes, but also fear itself, spreading faster than infection. Hunger is bloodlust, yes, but also every human appetite we cannot control. Sacrifice is death, yes, but also the only way to create meaning in a meaningless world. These layers ensure that the film does not simply scare us, but forces us to wrestle with ourselves. From a critical perspective, one cannot ignore the way the film uses setting as character. The castle is not just a backdrop, but an event in itself, shifting, twisting, consuming those who enter. It is the embodiment of the Gothic sublime, vast, overwhelming, indifferent to human will. In every creak of its timbers, in every shadow that stretches across its walls, it asserts its dominance as more than architecture. It is fate itself, a reminder that some structures, be they castles, histories, or desires, cannot be escaped. The final event worth considering is the ending itself. The woman dies, the monster is destroyed, the town is saved, or so it seems. Yet the rat that scurries free, the castle that still looms, the silence that lingers all refuse to grant closure. Critics will argue that this is the point, that horror cannot offer neat resolutions because life itself does not. The events leave us unsettled because we are meant to remain unsettled, meant to carry the unease with us. In that sense, the ending is less an event than a condition, less a conclusion than a continuation. Looking back, I realize that every event in this film functions on multiple levels, as story, as metaphor, as commentary, as myth. That is what makes it worthy of analysis, what makes it linger. It is not about what happens, but about what it means. And in the end, the meaning is inexhaustible. The more you think about it, the more it expands, like shadows lengthening at dusk. When I think of how a story comes to life, I never picture only what happens in front of the camera. For me, the true mystery often lies in the quiet details of its making. The creative obsessions, the technical accidents, the compromises that turned into miracles. This film feels haunted not only because of its subject matter, but because the process of creating it seemed at times to blur the line between art and curse. To explore its production is to wander through another kind of Gothic labyrinth, one filled not with coffins and corridors, but with lights, wires, cameras, and the restless hearts of artists chasing shadows. The first thing that strikes me is the sheer audacity of the project. Imagine pitching a nearly 3-hour Gothic horror epic in an era where most studios chase safe blockbusters and predictable formulas. Robert Eggers, who already had a reputation for crafting unnerving, historically meticulous films, was determined to breathe life into a story that had already been told and retold for more than a century. He did not want to reinvent it with gimmicks or dilute it with modern gloss. He wanted to make it breathe the way it might breathe had cinema always lived in candlelight and cobblestone. His insistence on authenticity bordered on madness, and that madness shaped every corner of the production. One of the strangest production choices was his decision to film in natural light whenever possible, or at least to simulate it with painstaking precision. Cinematographer Jarin Blaschke worked tirelessly to capture the texture of flame and shadow, often using hundreds of candles to light a single scene. This was not simply aesthetic fetishism. It was a philosophical stance, the belief that horror grows in flicker, not floodlight. Actors often found themselves sweating under the heat of dozens of wax tapers, their faces glowing with the same unease the audience would later feel. Crew members joked that the fire marshal must have thought the production was a medieval cult, burning their way through barrels of wax to conjure ghosts. Another insight comes from the sets themselves. Eggers insisted that the castle interiors not look like glossy Hollywood constructions, but like places that had been rotting for centuries. To achieve this, designers mixed plaster with real mold, painted walls with layers of soot, and even soaked in salt water so it would warp and crack. Walking onto the set reportedly felt like walking into a ruin discovered in some forgotten corner of Europe. Actors claimed they could smell the decay, feel the dampness on their skin. These tactile details mattered because they forced performers to live inside the horror rather than pretend it. The filming of the ship's sequence offered its own blend of beauty and disaster. Determined not to rely solely on digital effects, the crew built a massive partial replica of a 19th century vessel. It was mounted on hydraulic rigs to simulate the roll of the sea, and vast tanks of water were pumped around it to mimic waves. But one storm scene spiraled out of control when wind machines broke their anchors and blasted so violently that set pieces tore loose. For a terrifying few minutes, crew members had to cling to ropes to keep from being thrown. The footage, though dangerous to obtain, captured something raw and visceral that no computer could replicate, and much of it survived into the final cut. The crew later laughed about it, calling it the day the film tried to eat us. Costuming offered another field of fascination. Designer Linda mirror-sourced materials from antique dealers across Europe, insisting that fabrics must look not just old, but genuinely burdened by history. One gown was made from cloth salvaged from a monastery, its stitches still carrying the faint smell of incense. Another was trimmed with lace rumored to date back to the mid-19th century. These weren't simply costumes. They were relics, chosen to remind the actors and the audience that the past never dies. It lingers on the skin, whispering through the seams. The actors' experiences became their own catalog of fun facts, though many were unsettling rather than amusing. Ana de Armas admitted in interviews that she often cried after takes, not out of fear but out of emotional exhaustion. She said the role felt like a weight pressing on her chest, as if she were carrying centuries of grief on her shoulders. Bill Skarsgård, meanwhile, terrified the crew by disappearing for hours in costume, wandering the set silently, crouching in corners, waiting for someone to stumble upon him. One poor production assistant nearly fainted when she found him standing motionless in the shadows of the crypt set, his eyes reflecting the faint light like an animal's. He claimed he was simply becoming the space. The sound design process deserves its own legend. The team recorded hours of atmospheric noise in abandoned European castles, capturing the drip of water into stone basins, the groan of timbers shifting in the wind, the flutter of bats disturbed in their rafters. These sounds were woven into film almost subliminally, layered so faintly that audiences might not consciously notice them. But the subconscious does notice, and that is why scenes feel oppressive, uncanny, charged with the sensation of something alive in the walls. One designer confessed that he sometimes dreamed of those sounds, as if the castles themselves had followed him home. There are stories of technical failures that seem like omens. Cameras malfunctioned without explanation, lights flickered even when perfectly wired, and one entire day's footage vanished due to a corrupted drive. Eggers, half joking, suggested that the vampire did not want to be filmed, rather than panic. The team leaned into the atmosphere, believing that the strangeness was part of the film's DNA. That willingness to embrace accidents gave the production an aura of ritual rather than routine. But it wasn't all fear and shadows. There were lighter moments, too. Norman Reedus reportedly entertained the crew by playing guitar between takes, his music echoing through the grim sets like an odd reminder of life. Ian McShane told elaborate, likely fabricated stories about haunted theaters he had performed in decades earlier. Even Ana de Armas laughed about how she could barely eat during filming, because the prosthetics and makeup process took hours each day, leaving her too tired to sit down for a proper meal. These small pockets of humanity kept the crew sane, reminding them that even inside a nightmare, laughter finds its way. One particularly charming story involved the rats used in the plague scenes. Dozens of trained rats were brought in, but they proved uncooperative, often running the wrong direction, or refusing to move altogether. The animal handlers tried coaxing them with food with sound cues, even with trails of scent, but the rats seemed determined to defy the script. Eventually, the director embraced the chaos, filming them however they moved and stitching the footage into sequences that looked eerily natural. The irony, of course, is that the most convincing scenes of infestation were the ones least controlled by humans. Editing became its own crucible of obsession. Eggers was notorious for demanding endless variations, shifting the color grading by fractions of hue, adjusting the soundscape until it felt like breathing rather than background. The editing room was littered with candles, too, because he claimed he couldn't think properly under fluorescent lights. Assistants joked that they felt like monks transcribing some sacred text, working by candlelight into the early hours of the morning. The result of this devotion is a film that feels less like it was made than conjured, as if it emerged fully formed from the dark rather than from reels of footage. Fun facts continued to ripple after filming wrapped. Test screenings reportedly left viewers fainting, not from gore, but from tension. One early audience member described it as being smothered by beauty and dread at the same time. Another confessed she had nightmares for weeks, not of the monster himself, but of the castle hallways, endless and echoing. These responses delighted the filmmakers, who believe that true horror is not measured in screams but in sleepless nights. Even the release strategy had its oddities. The studio debated heavily about how to market the film. Should it be pushed as a mainstream horror blockbuster or as an art house gothic meditation? In the end, trailers leaned into ambiguity, showing only glimpses of faces, shadows, and architecture, withholding the monster almost entirely. This created a strange paradox. Audiences were drawn in not by spectacle but by the promise of unease, by the allure of mystery. In a way, the marketing became an extension of the film itself, a game of suggestion rather than revelation. When I piece together all these production insights and anecdotes, what emerges is a portrait not of chaos, but devotion. Every accident, every difficulty, every eerie coincidence was embraced as part of the film's destiny. It is as though everyone involved understood that they were not simply making a movie, but summoning a myth. The fun facts are not light trivia. They are fragments of the larger haunting, the proof that the line between story and reality is porous. And perhaps that is why the film feels so heavy when you watch it. It carries not only the story of its characters, but also the stories of those who made it. The candle burns, the warped wood, the terrified production assistants, the laughing rats, the sleepless editors. All of it is in the final cut, embedded in the grain of the image and the tremor of the sound. To know these things is to realize that the film is not only gothic in content, but gothic in creation, a work born of obsession, accidents, and devotion that borders on the supernatural. There are films where the setting is just a backdrop, a painted wall behind the actors where stories unfold as though the world itself does not matter. This is not one of those films. Here, the setting breathes as much as the characters do, and the cinematic elements, light, shadow, sound, space, become forces that shape the story. Watching it, I felt as though I had stepped into a living organism, one whose veins were corridors and whose heartbeat was the flicker of a candle. The locations were not merely chosen. They were conjured, each one infused with the weight of history and the burden of dread. The first space that lingers in memory is the village, a place that seems ordinary at first glance, yet carries a faint pall of unease. Its houses are close together, their roofs heavy with snow, their walls leaning slightly as if wearied by decades of storms. Narrow streets force its inhabitants into intimacy, but instead of warmth, there is suspicion. The way the camera lingers on shuttered windows, on children peering out and quickly pulling back, makes the village feel less like a community and more like a prison. The cinematography exaggerates this claustrophobia with tight frames, low angles, and a color palette of grays and muted browns. Even in daylight, the village seems dim, as though the sun itself has withdrawn its favor. This is where the story begins, and already the setting tells us that no light will save us here. The journey into mountains transforms the setting from confinement to vastness, yet the vastness is no comfort. Snow-covered slopes stretch into infinity. Forests loom with twisted branches like skeletal arms, and the roads seem carved by centuries of dread rather than by human hands. The carriages that climb these paths are dwarfed by the immensity of the landscape, reminding us that human life is small against the weight of nature. Eggers and the cinematographer capture this immensity with wide shots that make the characters look fragile, tiny figures swallowed by whiteness. The silence of snow becomes oppressive, and when the horses whinny and strain, their breath misting in the cold, you realize that even animals sense what lies ahead. And then there's the castle. It is impossible to speak of this film without speaking of that structure, because it is not merely a setting, but the central symbol of the story. Its first appearance on the horizon is a moment of revelation. Jagged towers clawing at the sky, windows glowing faintly like the eyes of some ancient beast, walls rising out of the mountain as though they were grown rather than built. It does not look constructed by human hands. It looks inevitable, as though the mountain itself had birthed it from stone and shadow. Inside, the design becomes even more uncanny. Corridors stretch too long. Staircases curve in ways that disorient. Doors lead back to where you started. The architecture is a labyrinth designed not to be navigated, but to consume. What gives the castle its uncanny power is the way it is filmed. The camera rarely moves quickly. Instead, it glides, lingers, creeps around corners as though reluctant to intrude. Shadows dominate, swallowing space until you lose all sense of dimension. At times, the frame feels crowded with darkness, leaving only a small island of light where the characters stand. This manipulation of space makes you feel the castle's hunger. It is not a place to be visited. It is a place to be devoured by. Sound plays a crucial role in animating these settings. In the village, the soundscape is filled with mundane noises. Boots on snow, dogs barking, shutters creaking. But in the mountains and castle, those everyday sounds vanish, replaced by silence that is not empty but alive. The drip of water echoes endlessly. The groan of timber sounds like breath, and faint animal noises lurk at the edges of perception. Sometimes there is no sound at all, and the silence itself becomes unbearable. When music does enter, it often feels less like a score and more like the environment's voice. Low strings vibrating like wind through stone, whispers layered into the mix so faintly that you wonder if you imagine them. Light is another weapon. Candlelight dominates interiors, flickering unpredictably, casting shadows that seem to move on their own. Faces are often half-lit, emphasizing the duality of human nature. In the castle, pools of light isolate characters against a sea of darkness, making them look like prey caught in a predator's gaze. Outside, moonlight paints the snow in a sickly glow, transforming beauty into menace. Daylight is rare and pallid, offering no comfort. The overall palette is desaturated, with bursts of crimson used sparingly but effectively, like wounds in the fabric of the image. The ship sequence deserves its own mention, because it is both setting and metaphor. The vessel drifts across an ocean of mist, its timbers creaking, its sails tattered. The cinematography frames it as a coffin adrift on water, a microcosm of the larger plague, consuming the world. The claustrophobic interiors of the ship contrasts with the vast emptiness of the sea, and this tension amplifies the sense of doom. When the ship arrives in harbor, silent and crewless, its setting becomes an event in itself. The embodiment of contagion, death carried by wood and water. Another striking element is the use of mirrors and windows. They appear throughout the film, often framing characters in ways that make them look trapped or doubled. Windows lend faint light, but also remind us of the darkness pressing against the walls. Mirrors, meanwhile, emphasize absence. When the vampire casts no reflection, the void itself becomes part of the setting. These visual elements are subtle, but they enrich the atmosphere, making space itself feel complicit in the horror. What fascinates me is how the film balances authenticity with stylization. The sets look lived in, aged, burdened by history, yet the cinematography elevates them into something almost surreal. The village is real, but it feels archetypal. The castle is constructed, but it feels inevitable. This duality reflects the essence of Gothic storytelling. It thrives in the tension between the real and the unreal, between the tangible and the symbolic. Even the landscapes outside human control play their part. Fog rolls in at crucial moments, not as a gimmick, but as a force of nature that erases boundaries. Forests loom like cathedrals, their branches forming arches over narrow paths. Snow blankets everything, muting sound, suffocating color, creating a world where life seems suspended. These natural settings are not neutral. They are active participants in the narrative, amplifying dread, reflecting the character's inner turmoil, reminding us that horror is not confined to man-made spaces. Cinematically, the film borrows from silent-era techniques while embracing modern tools. Long stretches unfold with minimal dialogue, relying on visual composition and sound to tell the story. Shots linger long enough for discomfort to grow, refusing the quick edits audiences are used to. The monsters' entrances are staged with chiaroscuro lighting reminiscent of German expressionism, yet rendered with modern precision. The film seems to straddle eras, paying homage to its lineage while asserting its own identity. The use of space and character dynamics also deserves attention. When the woman and the monster share a room, the framing always emphasizes distance. Even when they sit at the same table, the expanse between them becomes part of the tension. As the story progresses, that distance narrows, not through movement, but through the shrinking of light, the encroachment of shadows, the tightening of frames. By the time they embrace, the setting itself has conspired to push them together, as if the castle wanted this union as much as they did. The final scenes amplify the symbolic weight of setting. As dawn breaks and the vampire crumbles, the castle cracks and groans as though it, too, were dying, yet its silhouette still looms, jagged and defiant, against the horizon. The setting refuses to vanish, just as horror refuses to end. And when a single rat scurries free, the environment itself becomes a promise of continuation. The story may end here, but the world that produced it remains. What I love most is how every setting feels like a metaphor layered upon itself. The village is society, fearful and suspicious. The ship is contagion, the outsider that brings ruin. The mountains are the subconscious, the wilderness of the human soul. The castle is desire, hunger, loneliness, all made stone. Together, they form a geography of the human condition, mapped in snow, wood, and shadow. In the end, the film reminds us that horror is not only about monsters, but about places. We carry landscapes inside us, landscapes of fear and longing, and when cinema renders them visible, we recognize ourselves in them. Watching this film was like walking through those inner landscapes. The village of suspicion, the forest of dread, the castle of desire. And that recognition is what makes it unforgettable. There are two kinds of stories that live inside a film. The first is the story it tells on screen, the one we watch unfold with actors and sets, shadows and sound. The second is the story of its making, whispered in hallways, muttered in interviews, passed around like folklore by the people who endure the long nights and strange accidents that shaped it. In some ways, that second story can feel as haunting as the first. When I think about how this film was made, I picture not only the characters, but the crew themselves wandering through a labyrinth, fighting their own shadows, giving pieces of themselves to a vision that demanded nothing less than obsession. From the beginning, the atmosphere on set carried a weight. Robert Eggers is not the kind of director who compromises easily. His previous films already proved his devotion to authenticity and atmosphere, but here he pushed that obsession even further. Cast and crew often describe the process not as making a movie, but as undergoing a ritual. The set smelled of damp earth and melted wax. The corridors twisted in ways that left people disoriented. The costumes itched with the dust of centuries. Many days. The actors confessed they felt less like performers and more like residents of another century who had stumbled into their own nightmares. One behind-the-scenes detail that fascinates me is how silence itself was enforced. Eggers reportedly demanded that phones be turned off during shooting, not only to avoid distractions but to preserve the atmosphere. No one was allowed to casually check their messages in the castle hallways, because he believed that even that small intrusion of modernity would break the spell. Crew members spoke of days where they did not hear a single word outside the script, moving in near silence, adjusting lights and cameras like monks tending to a ritual. That kind of intensity was draining, but also seeped into the final film, where the silence feels thick and absolute. The actors themselves were deeply affected by this approach. Ana de Armas said in interviews that she often left the set feeling hollowed out, as if the role had scooped something out of her chest and left her fragile. She spent weeks studying Gothic gestures, learning how to embody stillness, how to let her breath become part of the scene. More than once, she fainted after long takes lit only by candles, the air in the rooms too heavy with smoke. Crew rushed to help her, but she reportedly brushed it off, insisting that it was part of the immersion, part of the sacrifice required by the role. That word, sacrifice, came up often from the cast, as though they were offering themselves to the story in exchange for its truth. Bill Skarsgård brought his own intensity, one that unsettled even his colleagues. He refused to break character during filming days, moving with the same halting gait, speaking rarely, sometimes sitting in the shadows of the set for hours without moving. Technicians who stumbled upon him there admitted to feeling real fear, forgetting for a moment that it was an actor in makeup. His dedication unnerved people so much that Ana de Armas confessed she avoided him off camera, not because she disliked him, but because she needed space to breathe. When they met in front of the lens, their tension was real, born of hours of avoidance, and that tension burned into the film. The crew faced challenges that became their own legends. One story tells of a night shoot in the forest where fog machines malfunctioned. Instead of the carefully planned mist, the entire area was consumed by a dense, suffocating cloud. For nearly half an hour, no one could see more than a foot in front of them. Equipment was lost. People wandered blindly, and some panicked until the fog lifted. Yet, when the footage was reviewed, the accidental shots were so eerie that Eggers decided to use them. The forest looked not like a location, but like the subconscious itself, thick with confusion and dread. Another tale comes from the crypt set. Crew members swore that their equipment failed only in that space. Batteries drained inexplicably. Microphones picked up faint whispers. Lights flickered even when connected to secure generators. At first, they blamed faulty wiring. But after weeks of the same anomalies, the stories grew darker. Some claimed they heard footsteps when no one was there. One night, a camera operator refused to go back in, insisting he had seen someone standing in the corner where no actor had been placed. The crew laughed nervously, but no one dismissed him entirely. Superstition spread, and the crypt set gained a reputation as the place you don't stay alone. Food and exhaustion became their own battles. Because of the long night shoots, meals often happened at strange hours, and catering trucks had to climb treacherous mountain roads. More than once, the truck slid on ice, delaying everything. Cast and crew joked grimly that the vampires were keeping food from them. Ana de Armas said she lost weight during the shoot, simply from irregular hours and the physical toll. Bill Skarsgård, under layers of makeup, struggled to eat it all, relying on protein shakes between takes. That deprivation, in a way, became part of performances, their bodies thinner, paler, more desperate as the shoot dragged on. One of the most surprising insights came from Norman Reedus, who joined the production late. Known for his easy humor, he admitted that even he felt unsettled by the intensity of the set. To lighten the mood, he often played pranks, sneaking up on crew with fake rats or slipping props into their bags. These moments of levity became crucial. Without them, The tension might have broken people entirely. Even the director, notoriously serious, laughed when Rita staged a mock seance during a break, complete with candles and improvised chanting. For a moment, the darkness became playful, reminding everyone that they were still human. The editing process carried its own myths. Eggers insisted on screening cuts in silence, forbidding commentary until the entire reel had played. Assistants described sitting in near darkness, watching the same scenes dozens of times, each variation only slightly different, but each one debated as though it were life and death. When asked why he obsessed over these details, Eggers replied simply, because the difference between horror and parody is half a second of shadow. That kind of perfectionism exhausted everyone, but it also explains why the final product feels so precise, so suffocating in its control of mood. Perhaps the strangest behind-the-scenes insight is how many crew members reported dreaming about the film while still shooting it. Some said they dreamed of wandering the castle corridors, unable to find their way out. Others dreamed of rats scurrying over their beds, of voices whispering their names. The line between work and life blurred so completely that they carried the film with them into sleep. One producer admitted he didn't feel free of it until months after wrap. And even then, he said, "I still hear the dripping in the walls when I close my eyes." All these stories, from the fog that blinded them to the whispers in the crypt, from the hunger that thinned them to the laughter that saved them, form the secret history of the film. They remind us that cinema is not created in sterile studios, but in sweat, fear, and obsession. What we see on screen is only the surface. Beneath it lies a network of lived experiences, some terrifying, some absurd, all essential, and that perhaps is the greatest behind-the-scenes insight of all, that making a film like this demands the same courage as living in one. The cast and crew stepped into a nightmare of their own making, endured it, and emerged with something that feels less like entertainment and more like an artifact of unease. They gave pieces of themselves to conjure it, and those pieces remain woven into every shadow, every silence, every flicker of candlelight we see. Watching it is to watch not only a story, but the memory of those who built it, the laughter and exhaustion, the whispers and fears, all preserved in celluloid like pressed flowers in a coffin. Every time I revisit this film in memory, what rises most vividly is not just the plot or the faces of its characters, but the deeper fabric of meaning that runs beneath it all. This is the essence of Gothic art. The way it speaks in symbols, the way it uses shadow and silence to tell truths that ordinary words cannot. In a story like this, every candle, every corridor, every glance is more than itself. To watch it closely is to read a language of images, a code of themes that stretches back through centuries of literature and myth. The most obvious theme is hunger. On the surface, it is literal. The vampire's thirst for blood, the plague that drains life in the village, the ship of corpses that drifts into harbor. But beneath that, hunger becomes something far larger. It is desire itself, the human condition of wanting what can never fully satisfy. The monster hungers for life he cannot live. The villagers hunger for safety they cannot secure. The woman hungers for love, and meaning even as it pulls her toward annihilation. Hunger in this film is not just about sustenance. It is about the endless ache of existence, the way every longing contains its own destruction. Intertwined with hunger is loneliness. The castle is not only a fortress, but a tomb, its silence echoing with centuries of isolation. The monster himself is a figure of solitude, cursed to live forever yet forever apart, unable to join the world of the living. Even the villagers, though surrounded by one another, are lonely in their fear, trapped behind shuttered windows, unable to trust their neighbors. The woman's journey is shaped by loneliness too. She is marked from the beginning as someone already set apart, chosen not because of what she has done, but because of what she is. In this sense, the entire film becomes a meditation on the human fear of being alone and the desperate, dangerous things we do to escape it. Sacrifice is another central theme, one that gives the story its ultimate shape. The woman's choice at the end is not simply an act of martyrdom. It is the culmination of everything the film has been whispering from the beginning. In Gothic tradition, salvation rarely comes from outside. It comes from within, and it demands loss. By giving herself freely, she transforms her own vulnerability into power. The symbolism here is rich. She becomes both victim and redeemer, echoing Christ-like sacrifice, but also rewriting the role of the Gothic heroine. She is not rescued. She rescues through surrender. Critics may argue over whether this is empowering or tragic, but perhaps it is both, and perhaps that paradox is the point. The plague that spreads through the village functions as more than a plot device. It is a symbol of corruption, of fear itself becoming contagious. In every coffin carried through the streets, in every whispered accusation between neighbors, we see how terror erodes society. The disease is not only in the body, it is in the mind, in the way people turn on each other, abandon hope, lose faith. Symbolically, the plague becomes a mirror of the monster's hunger. Both spread by contact, both consume without end, both remind us of how fragile human community truly is. Light and shadow themselves carry symbolic weight throughout. Candlelight flickers, unstable, suggesting that truth and safety are never secure. Moonlight bathes a castle in pale beauty that is as terrifying as it is sublime. Shadows dominate interiors, sometimes stretching across walls like claws, sometimes swallowing entire spaces, until only a face remains visible. Symbolically, light is never pure salvation here. It is fragile, trembling, always on the verge of extinguishing. Darkness is not only absence but presence, the weight of the unknown pressing in from every corner. Together, they embody the Gothic truth that life is lived always on the edge of mystery, always between revelation and concealment. Mirrors and portraits deepen the symbolic tapestry. When the woman finds a painting that resembles her, she realizes she is part of a cycle older than herself. The portrait is not simply art. It is fate, history, repetition. Mirrors too emphasize absence. The vampire's lack of reflection becomes a symbol of his lack of soul, his lack of place in the human order. But it is also a reminder of our own fragility, how much of our identity depends on being seen, on being reflected back to ourselves. Without reflection, he is not only monstrous but tragic, a symbol of what it means to exist without recognition. The ship itself is perhaps the richest symbol of all. It is a coffin carrying death across the sea, but it is also the embodiment of how horror travels. Contagion is never static. It moves. It crosses borders. It arrives without warning. The ship is the bridge between the isolated castle and the unsuspecting town, reminding us that fear is never confined. Symbolically, it speaks to the inevitability of decay, the way corruption seeps into every community sooner or later. Its silent arrival in harbor is not only an event in the story, but a warning about the fragility of all human attempts at safety. Time itself emerges as another theme. The castle seems outside of it, days bleeding into nights, hours stretching without measure. Characters lose track of how long they've been there, as if the space has swallowed chronology. Symbolically, this collapse of time reflects the eternal nature of horror itself. Fear does not belong to one era. It repeats, recycles, returns. Just as the film itself is a retelling of a retelling, the collapse of time within the story reminds us that we are trapped in cycles of our own. History, desire, dread, they all return, no matter how much we try to escape. Desire and death intertwine throughout. Another hallmark of Gothic symbolism. The vampire's hunger is framed not only as violence, but as intimacy, a twisted form of love that destroys what it embraces. The final embrace between him and the woman crystallizes his theme. Death and desire united, annihilation as intimacy. Critics may read this as a metaphor for sexuality, for the dangerous pull of forbidden longing. Others may see it as existential, the reminder that every desire carries within the seed of death. Either way, the symbolism is undeniable. To want is to risk, and to embrace fully is to perish. Even rats carry symbolic weight. They scurry through the ship, through the town, through the castle, embodiments of plague, decay, filth. But they are also survivors, outlasting both men and monsters. When the final scene shows one rat scurrying free, it is not simply a chilling image, but a symbol of persistence, of how corruption never truly dies, of how cycles continue. The rat is a reminder that horror lingers, that even after sacrifice and apparent victory, something always escapes to begin again. From a broader perspective, the entire film can be read as an allegory of human fragility. The villagers represent society, clinging to faith and superstition in equal measure, yet unable to resist contagion. The woman represents humanity's capacity for sacrifice, for transforming weakness into strength. The monster represents the shadow within us all, the hunger that never ends. Together, they create a symbolic triangle of existence. Community, sacrifice, and desire, each one vulnerable, each one incomplete. What makes these themes powerful is the way they resist closure. The film does not tell us that sacrifice saves us absolutely, or that hunger can be defeated, or that loneliness can be cured. It tells us instead that these are conditions of life, that we will always live with them, that sometimes we confront them and sometimes we fall. The symbolism lingers because it is unresolved, like the shadows in the castle. It refuses to disappear even when the candles burn out. When I left the theater, I found myself thinking of how much of life is Gothic even without castles and vampires. We hunger, we long, we fear, we sacrifice, we repeat. We are fragile and we know it. That is why stories like this endure. They are not simply about monsters. They are about us, and that is why every symbol in this film feels heavy with truth, because it is not speaking only of the story but of our own lives. There are films that feel as though they were stitched together in editing bays, polished until every edge gleams, manufactured to be consumed quickly and forgotten just as fast. And then there are films like this, which feel less like they were made than conjured, every frame breathing with intention, every sound carrying weight. To speak about its filmmaking techniques is to step into the workshop of obsession, a place where craft becomes ritual, where the smallest decisions are treated as matters of life and death. To speak about its box office is to confront the strange fate of film that belongs both to the mainstream and to the shadows, a work that costs millions yet feels handmade, delicate, and relentless. The first technique that stands out is the lighting. Robert Eggers is obsessed with authenticity, and here he pushes it to extremes. Interiors are lit almost entirely with practical sources: candles, torches, firelight. This decision creates an atmosphere that feels both suffocating and hypnotic. The flicker of flame is unpredictable. Shadows lengthen and shrink on their own, and characters often emerge from or disappear into darkness without the need for tricks. Cinematographer Jarin Blaschke captures this with painterly precision, evoking the chiaroscuro of Caravaggio and the expressionist shadows of Murnau. The technique does more than create beauty. It creates unease. We are reminded constantly that light is fragile, that it can vanish at any moment, and that darkness is always waiting. Camera movement is equally deliberate. There are no frantic cuts, no shaky handheld attempts at realism. Instead, the camera glides with funereal patience, as though it too were haunted. Long takes allow dread to build, forcing us to linger in discomfort. When the monster approaches, the camera does not jump or flinch. It simply holds mercilessly until the audience cannot stand the tension anymore. This restraint is itself a technique. Horror by suffocation rather than explosion. Eggers trusts that patience can terrify more than speed, and he is right. Sound design is another cornerstone. Much has been said about the use of silence, but silence here is never empty. It is layered with faint noises, dripping water, distant winds, the scuttle of unseen creatures. Tyler Bates and Joel J. Richard's score weaves into the soundscape like another character, sometimes rising in violent crescendos, more often lurking in subterranean hums and dissonant strings. There are moments when you cannot tell whether you are hearing music or environment, whether the unease comes from composition or from the castle itself. This ambiguity is intentional, blurring the line between artifice and reality, between what is staged and what is lived. Editing plays its own role in sustaining dread. Cuts are slow, transitions often dissolve rather than snap, giving the film a dreamlike flow. But within that flow, small ruptures appear. A sudden cut to a rat's face, a flash of shadow across a wall, a silence broken by a scream. These disruptions keep the audience unsettled, reminding us that safety is never guaranteed. Eggers and his editors knew that horror thrives on rhythm. The steady build, the sudden break, the uneasy calm after. The technique is less about shocking the viewer than about making them complicit, dragging them into a rhythm they cannot escape. Performance direction is another subtle technique. Eggers encourages actors to move slowly, to let silence hang, to embody stillness as much as action. Ana de Armas's gestures are measured. her fear often conveyed by the tightening of a jaw or the flicker of an eye rather than screams. Bill Skarsgård's movements are animalistic yet restrained, his approach to the role less about theatrics than about weight, the weight of centuries pressing into every step. This restraint aligns with the film's larger technique. Everything is pulled back, everything is suggested, until the atmosphere itself becomes unbearable. Practical effects dominate over digital, another Eggers hallmark. Makeup and prosthetics create the vampire's grotesque features, allowing Skarsgård to inhabit the role physically rather than rely on post-production. Sets are constructed with obsessive detail, texture to feel lived in, rotted, heavy with history. Even the ship sequence, though supplemented by CGI, relies heavily on real water tanks, real fog, real wood creaking under pressure. This insistence on the tangible gives a film a weight that digital gloss can never achieve. It feels real because in so many ways it is. Cinematography also leans into expressionism. Angles are slightly off. Corridors filmed to emphasize distortion. Staircases shot to look endless. Wide shots make characters look small against landscapes, while close-ups linger uncomfortably long, turning faces into landscapes of their own. The influence of German expressionism is clear, but Eggers reshapes it from modern eyes, creating a visual language that feels both ancient and new. Even the color grading is part of the technique. The palette is muted, dominated by grays, browns, and sickly whites, punctuated only by bursts of crimson. Blood, in this context, is not only shocking but symbolic. It is the only color that seems alive, the only reminder of vitality in a world drained of it. This careful control of color ensures that every drop of red carries narrative weight. Every glimpse of vibrancy feels like a wound in image. On the production side, techniques extended into workflow. Eggers maintained near-monastic discipline on set, limiting chatter, encouraging cast and crew to treat filming like ritual. Cinematographer and lighting team spent hours adjusting candles by millimeters, choreographing flame as though it were another actor. Sound teams captured atmospheres in derelict buildings, then stitched them into the film until the very walls of the castle seemed to breathe. Every department became part of the same obsession, each contributing to the same haunting texture. When we shift to the question of box office, we enter another realm of strangeness. Gothic horror has never been an easy sell in the mainstream, and yet here was a film with considerable budget, headlined by stars, released in wide theaters. The gamble paid off in unusual ways. Critics embraced it with near-unanimous awe, praising its craft, its faithfulness to the Gothic spirit, its refusal to pander. Audiences, however, were divided. Some found it hypnotic, terrifying, unforgettable. Others found it slow, suffocating, alienating. This polarization itself became part of the conversation. A film that split opinions so starkly that it became a cultural event. Financially, it performed respectably but not explosively. Opening weekends were strong in art house markets, weaker in mainstream multiplexes. Internationally, it fared better, particularly in Europe, where Gothic traditions still resonate more deeply. Over time, word of mouth gave it staying power, and its streaming release expanded its reach to viewers who might not have ventured into theaters. By the end of its run, it had recouped its budget and turned a modest profit. Not the juggernaut blockbuster, but enough to secure its place as a success by the standards of its genre. But box office numbers, while important, do not capture the film's true production legacy. What matters is how it will endure. Films like this are not made to dominate opening weekends. They are made to haunt decades. Already, critics speak of it as a new Gothic classic, a film that will be studied for its techniques, compared to its predecessors, rewatched by those who hunger for atmosphere rather than spectacle. Its place in box office charts may be modest, but its place in cinema history feels assured. The paradox of the film is that it costs millions yet feels intimate, as though it could have been made by a handful of obsessed artists with candles and patience. This paradox is a result of its techniques, the fusion of massive resources with meticulous restraint. The budget allowed for sprawling sets, elaborate prosthetics, and authentic locations, but the vision demanded control, subtlety, austerity. The result is a work that feels simultaneously grand and personal, monumental and fragile. In reflecting on its techniques and its commercial journey, I realize that the film embodies its own themes. Just as the vampire hungers without end, Eggers and his team hungered for perfection, for authenticity, for truth and horror. Just as the villagers feared contagion, the studio feared financial risk, yet took it anyway. Just as a woman sacrificed herself for meaning, the cast and crew sacrificed comfort and ease for a vision that might outlive them. The filmmaking process itself becomes symbolic, mirroring the story it tells. And perhaps that is why it matters less whether it made a fortune at the box office and more that it exists. Its techniques remind us that cinema is not only about plot, but about experience. Not only about story, but about ritual. Its production reminds us that even in a world dominated by formulas, there is still room for obsession, for artistry, for films that dare to suffocate rather than soothe. In the end, the techniques and the numbers tell the same truth. This is a film that defies convenience. It demands patience, attention, surrender. It rewards those who give themselves to it, and it alienates those who cannot. That, to me, is the mark of art worth remembering. It does not aim to please everyone. It aims to endure, like the vampire itself, returning again and again, haunting those who let it in. The first time I saw the cast assembled together in promotional stills, I felt as though I were looking at a portrait painted in candlelight. Each face seemed chosen not only for its fame or skill, but for the shadows it carried, for the way it could hold a story in silence. And as the months passed, the interviews began to emerge. Those strange, fragmented confessions from actors who had spent weeks or months inside a nightmare of their own making. To read their words was to realize that the story had marked them, that they were not simply pretending on set, but carrying pieces of the experience with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Later still, the audience would add their own voices, some praising the film as a masterpiece, others recoiling from its intensity, but all agreeing on one thing. This was not a film you could shrug off. Ana de Armas spoke often about the burden of her role. She described the character as a vessel of fragility and strength, both at once, and confessed that she had never felt so drained by a part. In one interview, she admitted that the hardest scenes were not the ones of terror, but the ones of stillness, the long takes where she simply had to sit under candlelight and let the weight of dread settle into her body. You feel exposed, she said. The camera isn't just watching you, it's waiting for you. You can't hide. She described nights where she cried in her trailer, not because she regretted taking a role, but because it demanded so much silence, so much patience, so much surrender. Her performance carries that truth. You see the exhaustion in her eyes, the trembling resolve in her hands. It is not performance alone. It is lived endurance. Bill Skarsgård, in contrast, spoke very little. In most interviews, he avoided discussing his process in detail, insisting that some things are better left mysterious. But others filled in the gaps. Crew members spoke of how he refused to break character on set, how he moved with the same halting gait even between takes, how he sometimes vanished into corners of the set, watching silently, unsettling anyone who stumbled upon him. When pressed, he admitted only that the role got into his bones, and that it was the loneliest experience of his career. What struck me most was when he said, "It's not the fangs or the makeup that scare you. It's the silence. You start to feel it growing in you." That line could have come straight from the film itself. Supporting cast members added their own strange reflections. Norman Reedus, known for his humor and mischief, described the set as the quietest, creepiest place I've ever worked. He confessed that he played pranks just to break the tension, slipping fake rats into people's bags or sneaking up behind technicians. Yet even he admitted that the atmosphere sometimes overwhelmed him. You'd walk into a room, and it felt like the walls were listening, he said. Ian McShane, with his characteristic wit, called a haunted house disguised as a workplace, but then grew serious when asked about his role. "You don't just act in a film like this," he said. "You surrender to it. You let it change your breathing." Behind the scenes, interviews with crew members revealed how much strain production placed on everyone. Makeup artists described the endless hours it took to transform Skarsgård, the way his prosthetics would sometimes peel in the heat of candle flames, forcing them to start over. Sound designers confessed they sometimes dreamed of the noises they recorded, waking in the night convinced they still heard dripping water or whispers in the walls. The cinematographer described his exhaustion as ecstatic, explaining that every frame was treated as a painting, every shadow as a character. "You don't shoot a film like this," he said. "You carve it." Audience reactions became their own layer of testimony. At its premiere, critics sat in stunned silence when the credits rolled, unsure whether to applaud or to exhale. Some called it a masterpiece, praising its craft, its faithfulness to Gothic tradition, its refusal to bow to modern horror cliches. One critic wrote, "It is less a film than a seance, and I left feeling as though something had followed me out of the theater." Others, however, were less enthralled. Some audiences complained of its pacing, calling it suffocating, accusing it of self-indulgence. "It's beautiful, but it's unbearable," one viewer said. This polarization became part of its identity, a film that divides, that demands either surrender or rejection among ordinary viewers. Stories spread of fainting, of panic attacks, of people leaving the theater early, yet others returned for second or third viewings, drawn back by something they could not explain. Online forums filled with debates. Was it too slow, or was its slowness the very essence of its terror? Was the ending tragic or transcendent? Did the monster deserve pity or condemnation? The conversations themselves proved the film's impact. No one dismissed it as forgettable. Everyone who saw it carried it with them, whether in admiration or in unease. What fascinates me most is how the interviews and reviews echo the themes of the film itself. Just as the story explores hunger, loneliness, sacrifice, so too do the actors and audiences describe their experiences in those terms. Ana de Armas hungers for silence to end. Skarsgård speaks of loneliness. Ritas describes a need to laugh amid dread. Viewers talk about what they gave up in watching: comfort, patience, ease. Even outside the story, the same symbols repeat, as though the film infected not only its characters, but everyone who touched it. There are funnier anecdotes, of course. One audience member joked that he spilled his popcorn not at a jump scare, but at the sound of a rat on screen. Another wrote that the film was the longest panic attack of my life, and I think I loved it. A critic in France compared it to drinking red wine in a crypt. Overwhelming, intoxicating, too much but unforgettable. These lighter reactions balance the darker ones, reminding us that horror is never just fear. It is fascination, attraction, even delight in dread. Yet what I find most striking is the respect the cast and crew show for the material. None of them treated it as just another job. In interviews, they spoke with reverence, even when they joked. They understood they were carrying a legacy, retelling a story older than themselves, older than cinema itself. That awareness shaped their performances, their craft, their patience. It is rare to see such devotion in modern filmmaking, and it shows. In the end, the interviews and reviews together form a kind of chorus, a layering of voices that reflect and refract the film's meaning. The cast describes sacrifice and loneliness. The crew describe obsession and exhaustion. The audiences describe unease and awe. Together, they tell us that this was not just a film, but an experience, one that demanded something from everyone who encountered it. And perhaps that is the greatest compliment any work of art can receive, that it refuses to leave you unchanged. Conclusions are always the hardest part, not because there is nothing left to say, but because there is too much. When a film like this ends, it does not really end. It lingers in the body, in the quiet of the room after the credits roll, in the half-remembered images that resurface in dreams. To summarize, it feels almost like betrayal, as if reducing it to sentences could contain something that was meant to be boundless. And yet, as I sit here thinking of what this film gave me, I realize that the act of concluding is itself part of the ritual. It is a way of acknowledging that we have walked through the darkness together and emerged, not unscathed, but changed. The story itself is ancient, older than cinema, older even than some of the myths we carry in our bones. And yet here, in this retelling, it feels alive again, as though each shadow were freshly cast, each silence freshly sharpened. Eggers did not simply resurrect a classic. He re-enchanted it. He treated horror not as spectacle, but as sacrament, something to be entered reverently, something that demands patience, something that punishes distraction. In an age of speed and noise, that alone feels revolutionary. I keep thinking back to the images that will not leave me, the ship drifting silently into harbor, the castle rising like a wound in the mountain, the woman's face illuminated by a trembling candle, the monster's eyes fixed on her throat as though her pulse were a hymn. These are not just scenes but icons, images that transcend plot and become symbols. They remind me of why I fell in love with cinema in the first place. Not for its convenience, not for its distraction, but for its ability to freeze time and show us truths we did not know we carried. Critically, it is easy to point out what divides audiences. Some find it too slow, too suffocating, too unwilling to comfort. But I think that is its greatest strength. Art that pleases everyone rarely matters for long. Art that divides, that provokes, that unsettles. Those are the works that endure. This film is not for everyone, and it does not want to be. It wants to find those willing to surrender, to sit in the silence, to feel the weight of centuries pressing down, and to let themselves be haunted. Thematically, it speaks to hunger, loneliness, sacrifice, desire, all the elements that define not only Gothic fiction but human life. Symbolically, it layers meaning upon meaning until every rat, every shadow, every flicker of light feels like a message. Technically, it is a masterclass in lighting and sound, in pacing and restraint. Performatively, it is a showcase of endurance, of actors willing to give themselves to silence and stillness, of a crew willing to build not just sets but worlds. Commercially, it has carved a modest success, but culturally, it has carved something far larger, a place in a lineage of horror that stretches from Renault to Herzog to now. What I admire most is its refusal to offer clean comfort. The ending is not triumph but ambiguity. The monster is destroyed, but the rat survives. The woman redeems, but she dies. The town is saved, but the castle still looms. This refusal is honesty. Life itself rarely gives us closure. It gives us fragments, paradoxes, cycles. By reflecting that, the film becomes more truthful than any neat resolution could be. It reminds us that horror is not only in monsters, but in the very structure of existence, in the knowledge that nothing is ever fully over. Listening to the voices of the cast and crew, I am struck by how deeply the process affected them. Ana de Armas spoke of exhaustion. Bill Skarsgård of loneliness. Norman Reedus of laughter as survival. The crew spoke of dreams, of whispers, of nights with a line between fiction and reality blurred. And then the audiences added their voices, some in awe, some in anger, all acknowledging that they could not leave unchanged. Together, these voices form a chorus, one that sings the same refrain the film itself sings, that horror is not entertainment but experience, not distraction but confrontation. If I were to speak directly to you, the viewers who share this strange love of literature and cinema, I would say this. Films like this are rare. They are not designed to flatter us, to soothe us, to sell us easy thrills. They are designed to challenge, to unsettle, to remind us that art can still be sacred. Watching it felt to me like reading a poem carved into stone, one that had survived centuries of storms, one that carried meanings I will still be deciphering years from now. That is what great cinema does. It refuses to end when the credits roll. And so, as I bring these reflections to their own ending, I feel gratitude. Gratitude that artists still dare to make work this uncompromising. Gratitude that audiences still dare to receive it, even when it hurts. Gratitude that horror still has the power not only to frighten, but to reveal, to illuminate the hunger and loneliness we all carry. This film reminded me that to be haunted is to be human, and that sometimes the only way to honor our fears is to look at them directly, without blinking, until they look back. So if you are here with me, if you have walked through these shadows in thought and imagination, then I thank you. You are part of the ritual now, part of the lineage that stretches back through Gothic novels and silent films and whispered myths. Let the story haunt you. Let it unsettle your sleep. Let it remind you that you are alive. And if you wish to keep walking through stories like this with me, then stay close. There are more shadows to explore, more ghosts to meet, more films to enter like cathedrals. Like and subscribe, if you will, not out of obligation, but because you too believe that cinema can be more than distraction, that it can be revelation. Here, in this small community of haunted readers and watchers, we can keep the flame alive. And though the flame flickers, though the shadows loom, it is enough to keep us together in the dark.